Hello and thank you for joining us today at Distracted by Life. Our podcast is all about making change within yourself and your relationships. We share conversations, stories, and explore ideas coming from our lifelong journey of the high points and especially the low points where we learn to face our fears or cope with pain, loss, and failure. We do this in a discovery quest to establish patterns around our past and understanding whether we are tripping up from our past or being held hostage by it. We work on identifying ways to move forward, aligning our core values, and unlocking the keys to self-awareness, self-acceptance, self-compassion, and letting go of what is not serving you positively in life. A better you is always there, ready to explore in a new world. So let's begin. Conflict at work is inevitable. Conflict at home is inevitable. In today's podcast, we'll be discussing changing the conversation, specifically conflict skills for nice people. It's not a matter of if we experience conflict, it's a matter of when we'll experience it and what our options are when we run into conflict. Joining us today is Amal, who will give us insight into this all too important topic. Hi Amal, and welcome.
Hi Dan. Glad to be here, and I hope this podcast episode people find it useful. I find that the conflict in the workplace exists quite a lot, especially for nice people who are not able to stand their ground or be assertive because they're worried about not being liked or not being the most popular people in the workplace, or they are worried about being labeled rigid or difficult, and so on and so forth. This can apply both personal or professional. And so when we look at changing the conversation, either or in these scenarios, let's talk about organization. So organization require conflict, and pretty much conflict is basically, in a simple term from the dictionary, is the struggle resulting from incompatible or opposing needs, drives, wishes, or external or internal demands. So organization actually do require conflict to operate, because without it, there is no challenging the status quo. There is no making room for different views or diverse views in this case. Common conflict include making a trade-off between two priorities, identifying a gap or a risk in a plan, giving someone feedback that they don't want to hear. The third one, giving someone feedback that they don't want to hear, is actually quite sensitive and critical, because when we look at every organization, even the ones I worked in, when you are prepping for, setting your goals and doing your performance reviews, when time comes to have those performance review discussion, I've seen repeatedly some executive or some leaders provide some critical comments and reviews to an employee. They waited a whole year to actually provide that instead of giving those feedback up front as they go, so that to give a chance to the employee to actually rectify or be able to make some changes, as they go throughout the year. When you are giving that negative feedback at the end of the year, you're blindsiding the employee. You haven't given them a chance to correct their path or improve on a skill set or a task or how they handle things. And you wonder when the employee becomes so defensive, and then some actually take it as further as they actually leave the organization eventually, because you did not do what the steps of a leader that should be taken, which is at the end of the day, giving performance review and having this discussion is to uplift the employee and bring them up to the place that you want them to perform at. You can't do that at the end of the year. That is, if that's the intention behind the constructive feedback, then it should happen at incremental 3 months, 6 months, 6 months to 6 months. That would cover the whole year versus you're coming at them at the end of the year. This is definitely have a negative impact, and I've seen it over and over. When we talk about humans, really, and conflict, humans like to avoid conflicts. We are not comfortable with conflict. We tend to dislike conflict, especially in our groups, because we are biologically wired to get along with everyone or in the group. We are raised to be polite. The culture and the norms of organization often discourage overt conflict. So the result is that we often avoid conflict or drive them underground. And we see this because sometimes some leaders are very uncomfortable with the conflict. So what they do is either avoid, hide, or they do everything possible to try to kind of stay out of a conflict, because exactly for those reasons that we're wired to get along and we raised to be polite, and we want to, the culture norm and the organization kind of discourage the conflict. When you are actually trying to meet the conflict head on, sometimes you get labeled as being authoritative or difficult, and again, that does happen because it also depends on the tone and the way you take that meet that conflict head on. So when we do the coaching, we gotta ask ourselves. Usually in coaching, we ask, what are your conflict narrative? Where do they come from? Are they still valid? So these really 3 good questions when we're coaching somebody is that we try to figure out what the conflict narrative that the person have. It's where is it coming from? Because it could be rooted from somewhere else deep down. And that is the narrative that they carry on. Or the last part of it is it valid? Organization require conflicts. Human run from it. And the result is, I love this word, conflict debt. So organization don't want to, we do require conflict, because without it, that means in every meeting, in every business plan, in every strategic planning, all we're getting is a yes, and an agreement. And when you fill the room and your boardroom with bunch of people that all they're doing is agreeing, there is no way you can increase the level of productivity, innovation, and curiosity in the workplace. So you do need conflict to some degree, to some extent. But humans are wired to get along, so they run from it. And what happens is when we are hiding and running and conflict does exist, we end up having a conflict debt. So what is a conflict debt? A conflict debt is a buildup of issues that should have been addressed, but instead go undiscussed and unresolved. And I can tell you that happens quite a lot. There are multiple ways to get into conflict debt. You can avoid the issue altogether, taking it off the agenda. Let's table it for another time. Isn't that the famous statement that gets you hear on a meeting when people are not agreeing and they don't want to deliberate on the point any further and they want to take it off the agenda, off the table. You can discuss an issue but avoid the opposition by talking only with like-minded people. We tend to gravitate when we're not agreeing on something and there is an issue that it matters to us and the stakes are high. We tend to find people that are like-minded like us that will agree with the conflict and the issue that we want. You can also discuss an issue with the right people but avoid the friction by keeping discussions superficial and safe. I've seen all of this. I've seen the avoid the issue, the avoid the opposition, and avoid the friction. I've seen all of this in the workplace. Also in our in a personal level, I also seen that among family members. So when we look at conflict, that there are a couple of questions that we should be asking ourselves. And also that happen in coaching is that what are the biggest conflict that you have? How are they impacting your productivity, your trust, stress level? And we kind of unpack that in a coaching session to try to determine the negative or impact that could possibly have on your life. You know how sometimes people say, if you present facts in a meeting, especially in a workplace, no one can argue facts at all, with the assumption that you can win a disagreement over presenting facts. There may be truth to that, but in reality, facts don't solve fights. Facts present a baseline, a picture of what it is, but it does not resolve fights. Listening neutralizes the conflict. A lot of us in the workplace, and I've seen this also, is that because life is so busy and it's all about how productive you are and how we got to build up high-performing teams and we got to, result-driven and all, so on and so forth. People think they give you time and they listen, especially leaders, when they are high-performing leaders, have a hectic schedule, travel a lot, or always in meetings back-to-back. The problem is when you're not giving your undivided attention to your employees, you're sending a different type of message, is that they don't matter, or the conflict is not critical, or basically you're giving the message, has really not a big meaning or impact. This is not something I want to deal with, So, but if you actually think about listening, it does neutralize this conflict, because the biggest gap in having productive conflict is our poor ability to listen. When you teach people by modeling listening, and when I'm talking about level 3 listening. That's what we do in coaching session, and that's what they teach you in coaching, is that you should be actually with your client doing the level 3 listening. So let's break them down. So level 1 listening is basically listening with their ears, eyes, and heart. And level 2 listening to facts, feelings, and values. And level 3 listening, which is the most important one, is pausing the voice in their head as it judges, protects, or identifies. So in coaching, when we do this, it's basically we kind of try to figure out what percentage of the meaning, the facts, feeling, and info are you picking up from the other person when you're having a conversation. And you will notice that we are encouraged as coaches to actually be in a level where we can understand, because most of the people that you kind of sit with and talk to, you might find them sitting at a level 2, which is, that's where you'll end up picking up on the facts, the feelings, and the info. Level of listenings is very important to be familiar with, because like I said earlier, it's listening with your ears, eyes, and heart. That's your first level. Your second level is listening for facts, feelings, values. And your third level is being careful not to judge, protect, identify. So how do you teach level 3 listening? Basically, when you are in a conflict, and how you get to that point, to the level 3 listening. This is how you do it. If you are in a level 1, which is the level listening with ears and eyes and heart, less likelihood of triggering anger at not being listened to, because you're showing the person that eye contact, I am listening, you have an open heart, and just kind of seeing what the conflict is, what the issue is for that person. When you move into a level 2 listening, which is you're listening for facts, feelings, and value, it's less likelihood of you creating a frustration by solving for the wrong issue, because you could be in level 1 and really haven't listened well for the facts and meaning and values, and then you're jumping into conclusion. So you're not creating frustration by solving the wrong issue. When you move into a level 3, you're pausing the voice in their head as it judges, protect, or identify. So basically, you're being careful not to judge, protect, or identify. It's less likelihood of the retrench is based on the internal dialogue that the person is having, whether you or the other person is having. You want to make sure that you're controlling the internal dialogue, because what happened with the internal dialogue, as you're sitting there, you're judging the person. They might not see that this is what you're doing internally, but the next statement comes, or the next action or step you take, it comes from that place of judgment. So why poor listening entrenches conflict? Poor listening entrenches conflict because when we don't listen effectively to the other person, which I've been in that end as well, is that it doesn't feel heard and it becomes self-protective. So when you're not listening to the other person, or the other person getting the vibes that you're not listening to them, this is exactly what they feel. They feel they're not heard, and they get into a self-protective mode. Find new facts without changing their underlying beliefs. So maybe I believe something about specific conflict, but the other person who's listening, let's say, of that executive, they believe a complete separate thing of it, or have a different opinion of it. The reality is, without changing my belief of that situation, you need to find something else that also makes sense. Like find a common ground. Reject your inappropriate solutions and gets frustrated and dismissive. So when you're not listening to the person in an effective manner, this is what the other person feels. Doesn't feel heard and becomes self-protective. Finds new facts without changing their underlying beliefs, rejects your inappropriate solution, and gets frustrated and dismissive. So when I come into, for an example, as an executive assistant or an office manager, I come into the leader. I have a situation, there is a conflict taking place, and I state what this conflict is about and the reasoning behind my view. If the leader doesn't listen effectively and try to understand where I come from, I'm gonna end up feeling all of those 3 steps that I've actually mentioned, which kind of take us nowhere. And then we're just in trenches with the conflict. Effective listening helps you figure out what treasure their castle is protecting. So the stake is always high when there is a conflict. We need to find out there is always also 3 different truths. My truth, the other person's truth, and the third truth, which is supposed to be the neutral one, the common ground one. So if we can shift from these and able to arrive at the third truth, or the common place, we might understand what the other person is protecting. Poor listening causes them to fortify the wall and fire arrows through the battling basically. So when we put our back up, because now we're protecting and the other person is not hearing us, we start, firing at all cylinder basically. So part of changing the conversation is avoid invalidating the other person. So how do we what's avoid invalidating? It's basically we tend to contradict or disagree when someone says something that we don't like. That immediately flags it as an argument. And then you invalidate others by giving your opinion without addressing the other person's point of view, which I was just stating earlier, becoming increasingly polarized as the back and forth of progresses, turning your body or your eyes away from the person you disagree with, and instead that's exactly how we do it, but instead start by validating the other person. So what's the opposite of what I just mentioned is actually validating the point of the other person. Even if you don't agree, you gotta find that softness place to land at. So when we do the coaching part of things, we we tend to ask these questions. How are you invalidating? How can you tell? What could you do if you notice that you have invalidated someone or it's been done to you? So these are really good questions where you kind of want to self-reflect and help you, guide you. When you are in a conflict, you do not want to be invalidated. You want to be able to validate the other person. And validation, basically validating, means giving credence to the issue and the other person. It does not mean that you agree with what they are saying, but it also validates others by saying something to make the person feel heard and understood. Ask a question to get at the underlying issue and the concern, and paraphrase their perspective and speak their truth. This helps in diffusing the conflict. Conflict strategies for nice people can be different things. So we can run through this. So there are a couple of few things, and probably I've already touch on them here and there during the conversation. So we have the two-truth strategy, when you completely disagree with the idea. And basically the truth strategy is that exactly what I mentioned, the truth, my truth, your truth, and then you're trying to find the third truth, which is the neutral state. The root cause approach, when you don't like a proposed solution, but you agree that there is a problem. This is a good one, and it happened in business place. This is where most people can find agreement, is that maybe I don't like your approach, you don't like my approach, but we do agree on one thing, which is there is a problem that needs to be solved. So you go down to the root cause and try to solve it from there. The impact technique, to help someone spot the flaws in their own logic. So that one is basically when you look at someone's when you look at someone actions or what they're trying to take or solve for, you want to see that, you want to kind of look at their technique. And their technique probably is this: if the way they are handling something impacting someone else, you want to spot the flaws in the technique and try not to attack that person's, because when you look at, you don't want to attack the person, but you want to point out the negative impact that the technique or the way, the approach they're taking. The hypothetical techniques, when someone resists your proposal, which is basically you're presenting something, let's say a business case, and you want someone to not like, or reduce the friction or the resistance to your proposal. You want to start using hypothetical technique. What if we did this? Or what if it was done that way? And things like that. You start with statement like that. The common criteria strategy, when you have to make a continuous decision. So this is where you kind of find the common ground in strategy, in when you want to get some agreement. Get to the common place so you can actually reduce the conflict. Own the misunderstanding approach, when you just can't figure out what someone's talking about, or you're not sure if you offended them, you're not sure if you actually how you came across. So just basically the last one would be owning the misunderstanding. When you're exploring hypothetical situation, it could be something like this, a situation where your idea is rejected, and this is what it looked like. The bad impulses contradict the person. The realization is, if you make the person feel valued, they will consider the possibility. The technique is basically validate the objection, put it to the side, and ask hypothetical questions about your proposal, and then return to solve for the objection. Why does it work? Because it gets the person visualizing what's possible. There is another part where conflict become, an issue, is that when we have when we have emotional reaction. So don't fear emotional reaction. Many people avoid conflict for fear of triggering an emotional reaction. That's why we avoid it at all costs possible, because we can't handle the emotional reaction. Think of emotions as another data set you can use to diagnose the root cause. So think of emotion like pain. They can be important symptoms of underlying injury, but sometimes they aren't very diagnostic. Say something, say something like, this is important. What do I need to understand? To kind of to also kind of reduce the level of emotional reactivity. The injury will be at the level of the person's value, basically. Find what they value, find what value has been violated for that person, and you will find your path through the conflict. Because at the truth is when we are worried about emotional reactivity, fear is at the center of it. And usually the emotional reactivity is because we violated someone's values. And if we get to what that is, we can get through the conflict. Facts don't solve fights, like I mentioned earlier. You need the emotional data and the value insight to resolve the conflict. So sometimes in coaching, we ask these questions about what might be beneath the emotional reactivity. How could you determine what value is being violated? Because you'll end up getting those kind of strong stance that a person is taking. So here's what you want to do. You want to take the person through different steps. Conflict is in recapping all of this. Conflict is normal, inevitable. You can't avoid it. Struggle is required in teams and organization. Conflict that is more harmful than conflict itself, because as we mentioned, conflict that it's a combination of things piling up. Better listening is the fastest path to get through conflict constructively. Speaking the other person's truth before your own neutralizes the conflict. Resistance is normal. Expect conflict to take few rounds. Facts don't solve fights. Follow emotions to find values and solve at that level. So that's in a nutshell, kind of for now, the summary to some of the conflicts that we were talking about changing the conversation. In another podcast, we're going to talk about other aspect of the conflict and changing the conversation. I hope you found some of these helpful. Thank you for tuning in and joining me today. Until next time, we'll pick it up where we left off, furthermore into changing the conversation. Thank you so much. Back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Amal. And thank you very much for joining us here, everyone, at Distracted by Life. If you're interested to learn more, check out our other podcasts, of course, or hop online to Amal's website at amalcandido.com, where she talks about her coaching world covering life, leadership, and mindfulness, including links to popular podcasts and to her books as well. And with that said, stay tuned for our next episode from Amal and myself. Thanks again, and talk to you soon.